Hey everyone. Welcome to the Reddit Herald. Today, we're reading the juiciest and most addictive threads from Reddit. Buckle up, it's gonna be a wild ride. I woke up flat on my back, staring at a marble ballroom ceiling while the overhead lights spun around like a bunch of dying stars. My ears were ringing like a tuning fork, and I had that nasty, metallic copper taste flooding my mouth. Somewhere nearby, I heard the sharp clink of glassware, followed by a woman screaming her lungs out. Someone was yelling my name, but honestly, it echoed so weirdly it didn't even sound like it belonged to me anymore. The second I tried to turn my head, a blinding spike of pain shot through my skull. That's when I saw it, a heavy brass centerpiece rolling across the polished floor, leaving a thick, dark trail of blood in its wake. A few feet away, my old man stood there completely frozen, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Just 2 minutes earlier, I had been standing my ground perfectly calm, refusing to give in to a single one of their demands. I hadn't raised my voice, and I hadn't made any threats. All I did was say the word no. But man, that one little word unlocked absolute hell. I guess I need to hit the rewind button here, because absolutely nothing that went down that night is going to make a lick of sense unless you understand who I was before I ever stepped foot into that ballroom. My name is Cheryl. I'm 30 years old, and I make my living working in construction. Now, don't go picturing the glamorous kind of architecture people love to brag about at fancy dinner parties. I do the real grit and grit work, the kind of job where your hands stay rough and calloused no matter how much heavy-duty lotion you slather on them. It's the kind of life where you measure twice and cut once, and if you screw up the job, there ain't anybody else to blame but the person looking back at you in the mirror. Folks usually act pretty shocked when they find out what I do for a living. I guess it's because I don't exactly fit the mold of what they think a builder should look like, but I've learned to just let that stuff slide right off my back. I don't build things to stroke my own ego or impress the neighbors. I build them because I get a real kick out of knowing that something I put together with my own 2 hands will still be standing tall long after I've left the room for good. That whole mindset came straight from my grandmother. She was truly the only person in my entire family who didn't look at my love for hard work as some kind of tomboy phase I'd eventually grow out of. When I was just a kid, she used to sit at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around this old, chipped coffee mug, just watching me sketch out little floor plans on paper napkins. She'd give me this slow, thoughtful nod and tell me, "Cheryl, if you're gonna build something in this life, you make damn sure it can hold some weight." When she passed away, she left me a small plot of land just outside the city limits. It wasn't anything fancy by a long shot, just a patch of uneven ground covered in scrubby trees. It was the exact kind of place everybody else would drive right past and dismiss without a second look. My parents called it a total headache, completely impractical, and a giant waste of time. But where they saw a dump, I saw a foundation. For years, I busted my tail working my regular job by day, and then I'd spend my nights and weekends building my house. I knew exactly where every single electrical wire ran through those walls. I knew which floorboard had a little creak to it because I was the one who drove the nail into it. When money got tight, I choked down cheap meals and kept right on hammering. When I got banged up on the job, I just wrapped myself in duct tape and finished the work. And through all that time, my family never came out to visit the site. Not a single time. You see, to my folks, my actual worth was always measured against my younger sister, Melissa. She was the softer one, the louder one, the one who always seemed to need saving from some kind of drama. My parents completely orbited around her like gravity itself demanded it, and I figured out real early in life that being the dependable one usually meant being completely invisible. So, when Melissa announced she was getting hitched, everybody in the family started calling it a fresh start. A grand celebration. They claimed it was the perfect reason for the whole clan to finally get together under one roof. Man, I really should have known better. Because families like mine don't ever come together to share in somebody's joy. They only show up when they want to take something from you. What would you do if you realized your family only acknowledged you when they needed something? The wedding went down at one of those trendy downtown venues that looks a whole lot better in glossy photographs than it actually feels in real life. It had towering ceilings, crisp white linens, way too many mirrors, and everything was polished to a high shine. The whole place was custom designed to look absolutely flawless from the outside looking in. I showed up by myself and immediately felt that familiar, uncomfortable shift in the room. I noticed the way people would glance down at my dress shoes, look at my working hands, and then quickly dart their eyes away a second too fast. I eventually found my name printed on a little place card and followed it to a table tucked away near the very edge of the ballroom. It wasn't the worst seat in the house, but it sure wasn't close to the action either. It was just far enough away that I had to lean way over just to get a decent look at the head table. Melissa, naturally, was absolutely glowing. She floated across that room like she was born to be the center of attention, her dress fitting her like a glove and her laugh carrying over the crowd. My parents followed her around like a pair of lost puppies, adjusting her train, greeting the guests, and making sure everybody noticed the wonderful daughter they'd raised. Meanwhile, nobody even bothered to introduce me to anyone. Whenever a guest would ask what I did for a living, my mother would flash this tight, strange smile and say, "Oh, Cheryl is just very hands-on," like my entire career was some kind of quirky personality trait instead of a real trade. I even had a distant aunt lean over at one point and whisper, "Oh, that must be so tiring," acting like building a real structure was some kind of unfortunate medical condition. But I kept my mouth shut and stayed polite, because that's what I always did. Dinner hadn't even hit the tables yet when my father suddenly materialized right next to my side. Richard didn't bother taking a seat. He just stood there way too close, keeping one hand heavily on the back of my chair like he was testing it to see if it could hold his weight. "Good turnout," he said, scanning the crowd. "Big night for the family." "It sure is," I replied. My mother joined him a few seconds later, her fake smile already locked and loaded into place. Elaine had that specific tone dialed in, the one she always used when she wanted a conversation to sound sweet and friendly, even though it was anything but. "We need to talk, Cheryl. Just for a quick minute," she said. Right then, I felt this heavy pressure building up, like a physical hand pressing right between my shoulder blades. They didn't ask me how I was doing. They didn't ask a single thing about my business. They just went straight for the jugular. "Melissa is starting a brand new chapter in her life," my dad said, leaning in. "She needs some real stability." Elaine nodded right along with him. "A home, Cheryl. Something solid. And well, you already have one." I didn't say a word right away. I just sat there, honestly waiting for the punchline to drop. "There's a really simple fix to this," my mother continued, her voice smooth as silk. "You just transfer the deed of your house over to her. Just on paper, you know, as a symbolic wedding gift. She and her fiancé will take care of the rest." And right then, my stomach dropped through the floor. So, I asked them one simple question: what happens to me? They just looked at each other. It was that kind of look that tells you your answer doesn't matter a lick to them. My dad shrugged and said, "You're single. You don't need all that space anyway. You'll figure something else out." Right then, something shifted deep inside me, quietly and for good. They weren't asking for my help, they were just reallocating my property like a piece of old furniture. I looked across the room at my sister laughing up a storm, with my parents practically glowing right next to her, and the ugly truth I'd been avoiding for years finally stared me right in the face. To them, that house wasn't the product of my blood, sweat, and tears. It was just a resource they could exploit, and they expected me to just hand over the keys without a peep. I hadn't actually said the word "no" yet, but for the first time in my life, I knew damn well I was about to. They didn't even give me a second to catch my breath. My dad leaned in closer, his voice dropping into this tight, absolute certainty. "You'll do the right thing, Cheryl," he said. "You always do." My mother started nodding along, her eyes welling up with this practiced look of concern that was really just pure pressure. "Just think about your sister," she chimed in. This is family. You really don't want to be the one who ruins her big day. Man, that word, ruins, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I looked around at the whole scene, the fancy crystal glasses, the expensive white flowers, and all these guests smiling and laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire life was being negotiated away like a line item on a corporate spreadsheet. I thought about the nights I had to sleep in my car just to afford lumber. I thought about the splinters, the bruises, and that quiet, incredible pride I felt the very first time I turned the key in my own front door. I looked them right in the eye. I'm not transferring my house, I said. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just kept my voice perfectly steady. My mom's fake smile cracked instantly. Don't be difficult, Cheryl, she hissed under her breath. We're just asking you to help out. My dad's jaw clenched. You're being incredibly selfish. No, I told him straight up. I'm just being clear. Right then, the temperature at that table dropped straight to freezing. You wouldn't even have that plot of land if it wasn't for this family, my dad said, his voice turning nasty. Everything you own traces back to us. I felt something in my chest harden into pure stone. The land came from Grandma, I said. But the house? That came from me. By now, folks at the neighboring tables were starting to notice the tension. Chairs were shifting, and conversations around us started dragging to a halt. My sister was still out on the dance floor, either completely clueless or just doing a damn good job of pretending to be. My mother's voice sharpened into a blade. If you walk away from this table, Cheryl, don't expect things to stay the same between us. I knew exactly what she was threatening me with. No more holidays, no more birthdays, the end of the illusion that I actually belonged. But I just stood right up. I'm not giving my home away, I said. Not today, and not ever. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate you. I grabbed my bag, turned around, and started walking toward the exit. I distinctly remember thinking how bizarre it was that nobody tried to stop me, and how surprisingly calm I felt finally choosing myself over them. I took exactly 2 steps. Then I heard this sudden movement behind me, fast, heavy, and aggressive. I turned my head just far enough to see my dad's face completely twisted into something raw and furious. The public mask he always wore had completely shattered. Without a single word of warning, his hand wrapped around that heavy brass centerpiece sitting on the table. There was no shout, no threat, just the horrible sound of heavy metal slicing through the air. And then, everything went completely white. When I finally started coming to, it happened in pieces. The sound came back first, this sharp, uneven ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop, like a smoke alarm was trapped right inside my skull. Then came the light. It was way too bright, blindingly white, and my eyes kept fluttering open and shut just trying to fight through it. My body felt totally disconnected, like I was floating somewhere just above the floor. The floor. That's when I realized I wasn't standing up anymore. The ice-cold marble was pressed hard against my cheek, and my shoulder was burning hot from where it had slammed into the ground first. When I tried to shift my weight, a wave of nausea hit me so fast and hard I had to freeze completely, just focusing on breathing through it. Somewhere off in the distance, a woman was screaming my name at the top of her lungs, and someone else was barking orders for security. I could taste heavy iron in my mouth, and I didn't even need to touch my face to know I was bleeding out. I managed to roll my head just an inch to the side, and that's when I saw it. The brass centerpiece was lying on its side just a few feet away, with one of its curved edges smeared dark with my blood. It was a hell of a lot heavier than it looked, the kind of expensive, decorative object meant to show off wealth, not be swung like a weapon. It glinted under those fancy ballroom lights, looking completely ridiculous and out of place on the floor, like a big fat lie that had finally fallen over. My dad was still standing right there over me. His chest was heaving up and down, his eyes wide and totally unfocused. For a split second, he actually looked confused, like his brain couldn't quite process the violence he'd just committed. But then his eyes locked right back onto me, and whatever regret he had instantly vanished into thin air. "You don't walk away from me," he roared, his voice cutting right through the panic in the room. "You don't ever turn your back on your family." I tried to say something back, but my throat was dry and absolutely nothing came out. Suddenly, a shadow stepped right between us. "That's enough." The voice wasn't incredibly loud, but man, it carried. Daniel, my sister's new husband, stepped right into the fray and put himself squarely between my father and my body on the floor. He didn't put his hands on my dad, and he didn't raise his fists. He just stood there with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, staring my old man down like he was dealing with a dangerous animal that needed to be locked in a cage. "Step away from her," Daniel said, his voice cold as ice. My dad just scoffed at him. "This doesn't concern you, Daniel." Daniel didn't budge an inch. "It does now." Right on cue, the venue security guards came rushing into the frame. One of them grabbed my dad by the arm while the other started radioing for backup. My mother was hovering just a few feet away, frantically wringing her hands. But looking at her face, she wasn't terrified for my life. She was in a total panic over the massive scene being made in front of all their high society friends. "Somebody call an ambulance." A voice yelled out over the noise. As the paramedics lifted me up onto the stretcher, the whole room started blurring into a mess of colors again, with the crystal chandeliers stretching into long streaks of light overhead. Right before they wheeled me out, I caught a quick glimpse of Melissa standing completely frozen right next to the wedding cake. Her hands were clamped over her mouth and her eyes were wide open, but she didn't look worried about me at all. She just looked completely shocked that her perfect day was unraveling so publicly. The absolute last thing I remember before the ambulance doors slammed shut was hearing Daniel's voice one more time. It was clear, controlled, and focused. "Don't you touch her," he said, and honestly, it sounded a whole lot less like a warning and a whole lot more like a promise. I kept drifting in and out of consciousness while the paramedics worked on me in the back of the rig. They asked me what my name was, and I managed to give it to them. Then they asked me to tell them exactly what had happened to me. "My father hit me," I told them. Actually saying those words out loud felt completely bizarre, like I was describing a scene from a movie that had happened to some other person. By the time the ambulance finally pulled up to the hospital, all that adrenaline had completely burned off. It left behind this deep, throbbing ache that settled right behind my eyes and just wouldn't let go. The doctors patched up the gash on my head with a few stitches and told me I was dealing with a pretty nasty concussion. For hours, I just lay there staring up at the hospital ceiling, counting the cracks in the tiles and trying my best to block out the fact that my parents knew exactly which room I was sitting in. When the privacy curtains suddenly rustled, I flinched, bracing for the worst. But it wasn't them. It was Daniel. The guy looked like he'd just been dragged through a hurricane. He'd ditched his tuxedo jacket, his white dress shirt was completely wrinkled, and I noticed a faint smear of my own blood on one of his cuffs. He stood in the doorway for a second, just staring at me like he needed to prove to himself that I was actually still breathing. "I am so sorry," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "I should have stepped in a lot sooner than I did." I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "You did plenty. Trust me." He pulled a plastic chair right up to the edge of the bed and sat down. He clamped his hands together so tight his knuckles were turning completely white. "There's some stuff you need to know, Cheryl," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "Honestly, there's a whole lot you need to know. The house of cards collapses." He started explaining everything to me slowly and carefully, like he was trying hard not to overwhelm my bruised brain. He told me that over the last few weeks, a lot of things just hadn't been adding up for him. Melissa had been acting incredibly shady whenever the topic of money came up. She kept telling him that all the wedding vendors and payments were completely taken care of, but they weren't. Bills would show up in the mail, and then suddenly vanish into thin air. Just to be safe, Daniel had ended up hiring a private investigator to look into her finances. And what they dug up, he said, was an absolute nightmare. He started rattling off the debt. We're talking massive, rounded numbers that made my stomach do a complete backflip. It was just mountain after mountain of credit card balances stacked on top of each other. She was missing payments left and right, shuffling bills around like a shell game just to keep him from finding out. And that brings us to why they wanted your house, Daniel said, his jaw tightening up. They weren't asking you to hand over the deed to help her build a life, Cheryl. They were trying to use your property as collateral to clear her debts and make the whole mess disappear. I closed my eyes and leaned back into the pillow. Of course they were. It all made perfect sense now. And that's still not even the worst of it, Daniel kept going. Your parents knew everything. They've been actively helping her hide and move money around behind your back for months. Hearing that made something deep inside my chest go completely cold and still. I'm not marrying her, Daniel said firmly. I called the whole thing off tonight. I opened my eyes and looked right at him. I could see a massive amount of anger in his expression, and a ton of disappointment. But underneath all of that, there was something else, relief, maybe. He was just glad the truth was finally out in the open. You didn't cause any of this, Cheryl, he added, almost like he could read the guilt starting to creep into my mind. They did this to themselves. The verdict and the aftermath. By the next morning, our family drama was practically public property. The video clips from the reception had spread across the internet like wildfire. Somebody had captured the exact second my dad swung that heavy brass centerpiece at my head, and another clip showed Daniel stepping in to guard me. You couldn't hear the audio very well, but honestly, you didn't need to. The imagery alone told the whole ugly story. Once the venue's security footage filled in the blanks, there was no hiding from it. By that afternoon, I already had 2 missed calls from a local detective asking if I wanted to come down and file an official statement. By the time evening rolled around, my phone was absolutely blowing up with texts from extended relatives I hadn't seen or heard from since I was a kid. A few of them were genuinely asking if I was okay. But a whole lot of them were asking if I'd really thought through the consequences of taking this to the cops. The messages from my actual parents were the toughest ones to swallow. My mother practically begged me to tell the police it was all a giant misunderstanding, that my dad had just slipped on the slick floor, and everything happened too fast. My dad's text was a lot shorter and straight to the point, you pushed me to do it. I didn't even bother texting them back. Instead, I did the one thing I had never been allowed to do growing up in that house, I stepped aside and let the professionals handle it. I went down to the station, gave my official statement, and handed over all the video evidence. I just told the absolute truth plainly, without adding any extra drama and without apologizing for it. I didn't yell, and I didn't demand revenge. I simply refused to tell a lie to save them. Because the evidence was so overwhelming and there were dozens of witnesses, the police investigation moved incredibly fast. The grand old story my parents had relied on for decades, the idea that any family crisis could be smoothed over if everyone just kept their mouths shut, finally collapsed under the absolute weight of reality. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a quiet courtroom with my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to a prosecutor lay out the facts of the case. They brought out that heavy brass centerpiece and entered it into evidence. They played the reception videos on a screen, and they brought up just enough of Melissa's financial records to clearly establish a motive for the assault. My dad sat at the defense table and didn't look at me a single time. When the judge finally handed down her speech, her voice was completely calm, precise, and serious. She talked a lot about personal accountability and healthy boundaries. She made it very clear that being someone's parent doesn't give you a blank check of ownership over another independent adult's life. The final ruling wasn't some dramatic, Hollywood movie moment. There weren't any loud gasps or cheers in the room, there were just real, legal consequences. And honestly, that felt a whole lot more powerful to me than any shouting match ever could. As we were walking out of the courthouse, Daniel caught my eye from across the lobby. He just gave me this sharp, respectful little nod. And for the very first time since that horrible night in the ballroom, I felt the tension completely drop out of my shoulders. The long fight was finally over, but man, the silence that followed it was louder than any of the chaos that came before. What real justice sounds like. The weeks following the court date passed by incredibly quietly in a way that felt totally foreign to me, but it was incredibly welcome. My dad's social and professional world shrank down to almost nothing. The business and reputation he'd spent his entire life building up vanished practically overnight. Important doors stopped opening for him, and the high society invitations completely dried up. My mother tried her best to patch over the cracks with a flurry of apologies, but none of them ever actually reached the point of taking real accountability. As for Melissa, she completely vanished from my life, retreating into a total silence that spoke way louder than any of the flimsy excuses she used to make. I just put all my energy into healing up. The concussion symptoms took a long time to fade away completely. Some mornings, the bright sunlight would still make my head throb, and some nights, the memory of that metal cutting through the air would come rushing back entirely uninvited. But every single morning, I woke up inside my very own house. The house I designed. The house I built with my own two hands, and the house that absolutely nobody could ever threaten to take away from me again. Henry, one of my buddies from the local job sites, checked in on me constantly. He never pried or asked me to rehash the ugly details. He'd just show up at my front door with bags of groceries, a handful of spare tools, or just some quiet company when I needed it. One afternoon, while we were standing out on my back deck looking over the land, he turned to me and said, "Cheryl, you already did the hardest part of the job. You stood your ground. The legal side of things wrapped up cleanly with a clear paper trail, a final decision, and a firm boundary line drawn exactly where one should have been all along. For the first time in my 30 years on this earth, I wasn't constantly waiting around for my family's next big demand, and I wasn't bracing myself for another massive disappointment. I was just simply living inside a life that finally, truly felt like it belonged to me. And that peace, I've learned, is exactly what real justice sounds like once all the noise finally fades away. Now, a whole year later, I'm sitting out on my back steps at dusk, watching the evening light settle into the very walls I raised myself. The house is completely quiet, no demands, no built-in guilt trips, just plenty of open space to take a deep breath. I didn't lose a real family on that ballroom floor. I just finally discovered my own boundaries, and I learned the hard way that true love never asks you to disappear just so somebody else can stand a little bit taller. If you've ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to protect you, share your story below and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.